Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Melinda. Members, now let's head back, please, to Chapter 5, which appears on our matrix, page 4, number 9. There are, let's see, 1, 2 items on this, and there are some issues and some language changes, but the focus at our last meeting was overwhelmingly on the Bethel Island question and characterization. Mr. Ray, how should we go into this?
Well, let's talk about just the revisions we're proposing to the general language on DPP1. This would be item 9. The sixth draft of the Delta Plan introduced this policy about locating new development wisely, encouraging the location of new, what we called at the time urban development within cities or their spheres of influence. We understood that to include the areas in Contra Costa County that were within their urban limit lines, as well as the Mountain House area of San Joaquin County, as well as the legacy communities that are scattered through the Delta. And we drafted a policy we thought would accomplish that. The response we got from Contra Costa and San Joaquin County was, hey, we don't see the unincorporated areas that are planned for development, or for urban development within our counties mentioned here. And so we're just trying to clarify that by making explicit that we're talking about areas within Contra Costa County's voter-approved urban limit line and the Mountain House General Plan community boundary. An additional item then is how do we treat Bethel Island? Of course, the issue there is that when the voters approved Contra Costa County's urban limit line through initiative several, now more than a decade ago, all of Bethel Island, and large portions of which are undeveloped cropland, and other portions of which are really rural residential areas, were included within the urban limit line. And it's our advice to you that you not at this time say, hey, these are appropriate locations for new urban development, because there's too many issues that need to be resolved before it's an appropriate location for additional intense construction activity. And so we've suggested, because otherwise, by referencing Contra Costa's urban limit line within this policy, you might otherwise be signaling that you think that is an appropriate location for new urban development. We've included the exception for Bethel Island. How we draw the boundaries around the legacy community of Bethel Island indicate what portion of that area we think might be reasonable for development is a question that we would deal with then under item 10. And this policy this general clarification about the areas that are appropriate for urban development is also referenced in ERP3 and RRP2. These are the policies about areas that should be protected for ecosystem restoration and areas that where new development would need new residential subdivisions would need to assure that there was 200-year flood protection. Because both of those exceptions were put into the plan as an effort to provide a little flexibility for folks in legacy communities, especially to have economic development opportunities.
Sure. Don, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Yeah. Dan, the letter we received from Contra Costa County a couple of weeks ago, we had before our last meeting, I'm having a difficult time locating it right now, but from John Greitzer, that basically they expressed first their preference that, again, it didn't have to do with promoting urban development, recognizing the court case, and I think certainly the information that you've provided pretty extensively, both in the plan and its backup, but their preference was to have the entirety of the island identified as a legacy community. Now, again, what message you send or how you might rope that off might be a point of another, further discussion. Their second preference was to have some modified lines, but one of the things that occurred to me, just kind of looking through the document and thinking about Bethel Island in reference to some of the other identified legacy communities, is that, as you just said, trying to define the urban limit lines for legacy communities urban being the kind of the broad classification that's been put to commercial, residential, industrial uses that aren't ag or ag related. Again, that may not be the universal definition for planners in all the jurisdictions. Nonetheless, that's what we've used for this plan. But it would seem to me that respecting, I think, some of the testimony we heard last time, some pretty passionate testimony by folks, and I know that there's some in the audience today, and also hearing from the county, who again stood up, to the task of defending a lawsuit and so forth as it relates to that. It would seem to me there should be a way to, if this council so chose, certainly countered the recommendation you bring us here today, to put Bethel Island as a legacy community, but also make it very clear about what's recognized within that context. As it's not saying open us up for development because it's an urban limit line. Recognize there are limitations relative to flood protection and everything else that make it infeasible for the most part to certainly develop any time in the near future. So I guess I'd like to kind of know your thoughts. You bring us a recommendation. The county has expressed, recognizing the stance they've taken on urban development on Bethel Island, but that they still would like to see this as a legacy community. Now, I understood from the last council meeting that supposedly we're sending maybe some subtle message to folks that's wide open for development if you have a boundary that's bigger than the current footprint of any given area in a legacy community. And I know we've gotten some feedback on Walnut Grove as well, and I was going to ask about that at a later time. But I guess I'm kind of curious, is that your recommendation obviously is what it is, but have you had discussions with the planners there, Dan?
We have, again, right now we're trying to deal with item 9, which doesn't address the boundaries of a legacy community in Walnut Grove. It's just trying to clarify this general policy about where new development should be located. And what we're trying to make clear is that within the areas that we think are appropriate for new development are the unincorporated areas that are in the Mountain House General Plan community in San Joaquin County, and then not including areas that are outside the legacy community on Bethel Island, whatever that might be. And we're going to talk in the next item 10, about the...
Okay, all right, well, I kind of tied that back because it was certainly
Yeah.
connected, but if we take a certain action on this, I guess this might drive what we do on item 10, or no?
No,
Ian drives this.
Here,
10 drives this, yeah.
can I just suggest an issue? For purposes of discussing item number 9, Delta's Place Policy 1, I think we ought to just decide we're going to put Bethel Island aside for a moment.
Okay.
And that's because we need to have a general understanding of what the entire policy means. By the way, I note there are 2 references in the 2009 Act that deal with Bethel Island, and they're not directed to us. The first is in the Delta Protection Commission's required study to the legislature recommending boundary changes, primary, secondary zone. Bethel Island is mentioned as one of the communities that would be studied for the commission's recommendation, which is pending now, right, Don?
Right, well, yeah, we had the...
We had a preliminary.
Consultant did it, and Mike, I'm going to clarify.
Yeah.
Shadow from the commission, want to just...
Well, I'm just summarizing the issue, but I want to put...
You're on the wrong track.
Well, okay, I'm just referring to the code section. Why am I on the wrong track?
In your statement that is still under consideration. The commission finished the report. The report was forwarded to the legislature without recommendation. The report did state, though, that Bethel Island should be put into the primary zone.
I understand that. Yeah, right. Okay, so there is that expression. In addition, there is a mention in the Conservancy action on Bethel Island among other communities. But those are the 2 mentions in our enabling act. Okay, Chris, I've got that right? Okay. All right. So let's make sure we understand the language without regard momentarily to Bethel Island as it applies to other areas, Don. And you had questions on those?
Well, we can deal with this. We got some correspondence on Walnut Grove from the RD down there relative to the map, but I think it came from the landowners. I don't know if somebody's here to speak to that, but that was part of the correspondence we received. Did you note that, Dan?
I did, yes. And again, but the
legacy town boundary.
the boundaries that are recommended in the plan are derived from the Sacramento County General Plan. So I reviewed the RD's letter. Again, I can't tell if what they're trying to do is have the entire RD included within the urban limit line. Certainly parts of that, most of it in the county's plan are planned for continued agricultural use. They're not within what you would think of as a town, which is sort of how the legacy communities has been described in the past. And so, we're suggesting that, the part area that's appropriate for intense new development is the existing community. Now, we have reflected your suggestion language that acknowledges the importance of the local government land use plans, that recognizes that there may be minor divergences between what we've depicted here and what makes sense on the ground, that parcel lines and physical features should be paid attention to, as well as the local government land use plans that were in effect at the time the plan was developed. And so that, if there are errors in these maps, we would be happy to correct them. But it's my understanding that what we've got reflects the local government's land use plan at this time.
Just a follow-on question, Dan. I don't want to belabor this, but so certainly the communities I'm most familiar with are in Sacramento County, but there's a couple of other legacy communities as well. The boundary that's in place in whatever general plan, whether it's the 2010 or 2005, that is basically is what freezes the boundaries for these communities, and that defines the legacy boundaries of the communities. Because I think that's one of the things that came out. Again, I'm going to just reference very briefly here the economic sustainability plan, and I think the staff has worked hard to try to accommodate uses that are supported, but your towns, they're not incorporated cities, so they don't have these firm boundaries. They have the planning boundaries, and I think they're, you have accurate reflections, as best I can tell, in the plan. But the towns, they're all surrounded by agricultural ground, either that or waterways, and that's just the nature of the delta. And yet, over time, again, I don't see, particularly in the primary zone, you're not going to have any wholesale expansion. You'll be lucky to have any growth at all in some of these cases because of FEMA requirements and some of the other things that have come down the path, including some other policy discussions we'll have today about levies and so forth. But I guess I'm curious from the standpoint of, here's my question. From the standpoint of this plan, if we embed these in the plan, in these maps, which are reflective of current general plans, so these become the boundaries then that not only define the, quote, legacy communities, but then anything that would come in that would be adjacent to that line that, say you have in Walnut Grove on the east side, you've got the school there, so somebody came in to put a small tract of houses adjacent to the school, but that wasn't in the boundary. It had to go through a planning process, both at the county level, but also the Delta Protection Commission. That would require amending the Delta plan, or would be immediately inconsistent with the Delta plan, so it wouldn't even go forward.
It would require an amendment to the Delta plan. Of course, the tract of housing is a good example of how the overall policies of the plan work to encourage development within the legacy community so that they remain vital areas with a healthy community life, and while keeping rural lands for agriculture, because the policies of the plan in the risk section would say that you shouldn't have major subdivisions in rural areas unless you can provide 200-year protection. So there would be, in that particular instance, there would be a couple different issues that we would run up against.
Well, we're going to be lucky we get to 100-year protection since we're getting decertified in all the levees in the North Delta. So 200, worry about that another day. But I guess, the point I want to make here, it goes back to the economic sustainability plan, to long-term vitality of the communities, and not to be counter to this plan or to the goals, the co-equal goals. But the third leg of that is, Delta is a place, and the place doesn't mean is 2012 they got frozen time. Some of these communities look pretty much like they looked 100 years ago in some cases, as far as the original townships. They haven't changed very much at all. But if this is going to become so knitted in a way that the footprint, and whether it's Walnut Grove or Bethel Island or Clarksville or anything else, is that That's what it's going to be pretty much, because you've got all these things layered on top of it. That concerns me, is because it goes beyond the primary zone and all the intent, and it's not counter to agriculture. And I'm not talking about opening up, tracts of homes. I'm just using it as an example. We've spent a lot of time talking about this, but it becomes a real, I think, contrary point to some of the things we're trying to achieve here, but also maintain the vitality of these communities. And in the way we've classified urban, when it's industrial, commercial, and or residential, and I know that about the risk part of it, but some of those services might come, but if they're going to require amendments all the way to the Delta plan, I think it just makes it one more hurdle. And the ESP pointed this out, is that it's going to make it that much more difficult for these communities long term, for the life of this plan, be out to 2100, to, I think, see their way clear in some cases, because it's going to be so limiting. And yet and that's not, that has some policy things embedded in it, but it does concern me, because now we're freezing these lines in place, and that's the legacy community.
Well, of course, in many cases, we talk about our flexibility to adjust the plan over time as one of the assets that we can rely on to respond to changes, and I don't see why that wouldn't be true in the legacy communities as well. I haven't walked through every town with a county land use plan in my hand, but certainly I know in the Yolo County case, and I would imagine in many of the Sacramento County cases, there's vacant lands planned for development. Certainly in Isleton, there are vacant lands planned for development within the legacy community that can accommodate many uses for a long time, and great opportunities for redevelopment. We've tried to be responsive to the concern that the legacy communities have got the opportunity for economic development, in part by crafting this policy so that development actions inside those boundaries aren't covered by the plan at all. There'll be no additional regulations imposed on development within these boundaries as part of this plan. So we've tried to provide positive incentives through the way the plan is structured for economic opportunity there. We've also included a recommendation, and we look forward to working with the Protection Commission and the Conservancy. We've included a recommendation that encourages more detailed planning in those communities so we can identify what the real development opportunities are within those boundaries. Many of them are not fully taken advantage of today. One thing that I'm always impressed with is that the Federal Emergency Management Agency's flood insurance program actually provides an exemption from the floodproofing standards for historic structures, so that you could renovate historic structures and avoid what everybody else claims is a huge burden on development in the legacy communities. If we can work together with the counties and the DPC and the others to identify how that can be done efficiently, we can create economic development opportunities within those boundaries rather than require additional development that takes farmland out of production and demands additional services. So I think we're in providing a real response to the Protection Commission's recommendation. We have to have a boundary someplace if these policies that we've crafted to create these incentives are going to be effective. And we've tried to look to local governments for what those boundaries should be based on the land use plans that they've prepared. And as those change, probably the boundaries will change. I can't imagine those counties are going to be shy about coming in to seek those sorts of changes.
One other question. So the process, though, if there was a change, even a minor one, to the boundaries that are shown as legacy communities, then that would require an application, certainly to the county. They would have to come through here to amend the Delta plan, and the onus for doing that would be on the local entity, city or county?
Well, I think what would happen is Sacramento County, if in that situation, if it was in your county, they would be considering a land use plan change. So they would already have the responsibility to do an environmental impact evaluation on that, to do all the evaluation that's called for. Your planning commission would hold hearings, the county board of supervisors would hold hearings, and then the last step would be, it would come here as an amendment of the Delta plan. We're anticipating people will be submitting plans routinely to us for approval as various things are completed, as the flood plan gets to the next iteration. As other plans are developed, the folks from Sassoon Marsh have talked about bringing their plan, and local plans of flood control can be submitted for consideration as part of the Delta plan. So we see this as an iterative, changing document. We have to start someplace, and we've said, okay, we're going to start as simply as we can, and lay out some basic rules, and then things will grow as time moves on.
Okay. I'm sorry, Felicia. Excuse me.
Just going to say, I mean, I think the recommendation is one that is the heart of what we were supposed to do, and I think, as Dan explained, we've done it in a relatively modest way. We could have been much more dramatic on this, as on virtually every policy that we have in the document. We are taking a modest first step at things, which could be amended, as Dan said, of course, based on reasonableness and all of that, but not automatically. I mean, there is a role for this council to play, and that's very much set out in the intention of the legislation. So I think you all have done a pretty darn good job of being modest here.
Patrick?
I don't think legacy communities ought to have spheres of influence where the development has to meet a lower flood standard than we're applying to subdivisions in unincorporated areas in the Delta.
Well, that would open up a policy that's not before us today. That's certainly something we could consider.
Well, I think if you change the boundaries of legacy communities and broaden them,
then you inherently do
no matter
that.
what the community,
Yeah.
what's the point of it? It means the economic development potential is for housing. That's what it's for. And then the question is, to what standard will that housing be built for flood protection? And if in your legacy community,
You get a lower flood protection.
you can do lower flood protection than you can if you're not.
And
I
then-
mean, isn't that the practical incentive?
That's a practical incentive. It also, we have this policy here that says significant new development is not allowed outside of certain boundaries, except
Right,
for...
and,
Yeah,
we're,
but-
and we're taking exception, and we're making exception for the legacy communities, but a legacy community isn't an expansion of the community. I mean, that, particularly that's currently undeveloped and unzoned for development, and so...
Co-